My parents called me mentally ill in court. Those were the first words spoken about me as I sat frozen in a family courtroom, listening to my own mother and father explain to the judge why I supposedly couldn't be trusted with the inheritance my grandmother had left behind. They spoke with calm confidence, never raising their voices, making every sentence sound thoughtful and reasonable. Around me, strangers glanced in my direction with cautious expressions, as though I might suddenly prove everything my parents were saying. I wanted to defend myself, but every heartbeat made it harder to breathe. I couldn't tell whether they saw a frightened 17-year-old girl or someone they had already decided was unstable. Please stick with me because what happened inside that courtroom changed my life forever. And by the end, the people who tried hardest to destroy me were the ones begging for a way out. My name is Bria Knox, and only a few weeks earlier I had buried the only person who ever made me feel completely safe. My grandmother, May Rowan. Losing her shattered me, but grief wasn't the crime my parents made it seem to be. Kurt Knox and Lena Knox sat across the room wearing gentle smiles that fooled everyone. They insisted I had become detached from reality after Grandma's death and claimed they only wanted to protect me. Their attorney opened a notebook that instantly made my stomach drop. It was my private journal. He began reading passages aloud, skipping entire pages and removing every sentence from its context until ordinary sorrow sounded frightening. My words no longer belonged to me. They had become weapons. The judge never interrupted. He watched each witness, occasionally jotting down a note without revealing what he was thinking. When the attorney finally finished, silence settled across the courtroom. Then the judge calmly folded his hands and said the court would hear every piece of evidence before reaching any conclusion. As everyone stood for a short recess, I asked myself one question I was almost afraid to answer. Would anyone believe the truth before it was too late? Before the judge called everyone back into the courtroom, I lowered my eyes and tried to remember the life I had before every private thought became evidence against me. It felt impossible that only a few months earlier, my biggest worry had been finishing homework before spending the evening with my grandmother, May Rowan. She never rushed me, never dismissed my feelings, and never told me I was being dramatic. She had a quiet way of listening that made even my fears seem worth hearing. When I struggled to explain what was on my mind, Grandma handed me a simple leather journal with my initials pressed into the cover. "Write what your heart can't say out loud," she told me. "Feelings aren't dangerous when they're honest." From then on, I filled its pages with everything I couldn't tell anyone else. I wrote about school, missing friends, dreams for the future, and the fear of losing the one person who always understood me. Grandma never asked to read it. She believed some thoughts deserved to belong only to the person living them. When she passed away, it felt as if the safest place in my world had disappeared overnight. To my surprise, my parents changed almost immediately. Kurt started asking whether I wanted dinner from my favorite restaurant. Lena hugged me more in 1 week than she had in the previous year. They spoke gently, offered sympathy, and told relatives they wanted to help me heal. For a moment, I believed grief had finally brought us together. That illusion lasted only until Grandma's will was read. The attorney explained that Grandma had left a substantial inheritance for me, protected until I reached adulthood. The room became strangely quiet. My parents thanked everyone politely, but something shifted in their expressions. It wasn't excitement. It was calculation. The kindness vanished within days. My bedroom door was no longer allowed to stay closed. Lena began asking where I kept my journal and whether I was writing anything concerning. Kurt suddenly wanted to know who I texted, where I went after school, and why I spent so much time alone. Every ordinary moment became suspicious in their eyes. Then came the appointments. They insisted I needed counseling because my grief had become unhealthy. They repeated those words so often that neighbors, teachers, and even distant relatives started believing I was struggling far more than I actually was. Whenever I disagreed with them, they exchanged worried glances instead of answering me, as though my defense only confirmed their concerns. Little by little, trusted adults disappeared from my life. Visits with family friends stopped. Phone calls became shorter. Every conversation seemed to pass through my parents first. I couldn't understand why they suddenly needed everyone to believe I was falling apart. But deep inside, I began to realize something far more painful than Grandma's death. The warmth they had shown after her funeral had never been love. It had only lasted until they discovered what she had left behind. The warmth they had shown after her funeral had never been love. It had only lasted until they discovered what she had left behind. From that point on, my life slowly stopped feeling like my own. I noticed my journal was never quite where I had left it. Folded pages looked different. Bookmarks disappeared. At first I convinced myself I was imagining it, but then I found one of my private letters tucked into a folder on my father's desk. He quickly closed it when he realized I had seen it and claimed he was only trying to understand what I was going through. I wanted to believe him. Instead, they began collecting pieces of my life without my knowledge. A sketch I had drawn after Grandma's funeral became evidence that I was obsessed with death. A page where I admitted feeling alone was described as proof that I had lost touch with reality. Every sentence written during the worst weeks of my grief was stripped of its meaning until it sounded frightening to anyone hearing it for the first time. Outside our home, the story spread even faster. My parents spoke quietly with teachers after school. They called relatives before family gatherings. They visited neighbors who had known me since childhood. Every conversation followed the same pattern. They sighed heavily, said they were deeply worried, and asked everyone to be patient because I was not myself anymore. They never accused me of anything outrageous. Instead, they planted small doubts that slowly grew into certainty. People trusted them because they looked like exhausted parents trying to help a struggling daughter. When my English teacher asked if everything was all right, I told her I was grieving and that my parents kept reading my journal. The concern in her face disappeared almost instantly. She gave me a sympathetic smile and said she understood that grief could sometimes make people misunderstand the intentions of those who loved them. I realized then that I wasn't simply losing arguments. I was losing credibility. Every time I protested, my parents exchanged knowing looks. If I became frustrated, they called it emotional instability. If I cried, they described it as another breakdown. When I stayed quiet, they said I had withdrawn from reality. There wasn't a single reaction that couldn't be twisted into support for the story they had already written about me. Weeks later, I overheard my father speaking on the phone with an attorney whose voice sounded calm and confident. They discussed court filings, supporting documents, and medical evaluations that had never even happened. Before the call ended, I heard one sentence that made my blood run cold. If the judge declares her legally incompetent, the estate can remain under proper supervision. In that moment, everything finally made sense. They weren't trying to save me. They were building a legal case designed to convince the court that I should never be trusted with the future Grandma May had left in my name. They weren't trying to save me. They were building a legal case designed to convince the court that I should never be trusted with the future Grandma May had left in my name. When the recess ended, everyone returned to the courtroom. The silence felt heavier than before as the hearing officially began. My parents sat beside their attorney with the confidence of people who believed every step had been carefully planned. I remained beside my own lawyer, trying to ignore the curious eyes fixed on me from the gallery. The first witness was one of my former teachers. She testified that I had become unusually withdrawn after my grandmother's death and often seemed distracted in class. Listening to her, I realized she wasn't lying. She was simply repeating a version of events shaped by conversations with my parents. Small moments of grief had been transformed into signs of instability. Next came a family friend who claimed I had become unpredictable. A neighbor recalled seeing me crying alone in Grandma's garden. Another relative described me as emotionally fragile. None of them mentioned that I had just lost the person who had raised me with the most love. Instead, every memory was presented as another piece of a troubling pattern. Then my journal appeared again. My parents' attorney slowly read selected passages, pausing after each sentence to let the words linger in the courtroom. I feel like part of me disappeared. I don't know who I am without her. I wish I could hear her voice one more time. Separated from the pages around them, those sentences sounded desperate. No one heard the hopeful entries that followed, where I wrote about finishing school, honoring Grandma's memory, or believing life would eventually become easier. The parts that showed healing had simply vanished. For the first time, my attorney stood and objected. He pointed out that entire sections had been omitted and asked for complete copies of the journal instead of isolated excerpts. The judge allowed the request, though he offered no opinion. My attorney also questioned witnesses about dates, conversations, and specific events. A few hesitated. Others admitted they had learned certain details directly from my parents rather than witnessing them personally. The inconsistencies were subtle, but they existed. Kurt and Lena never appeared rattled. They answered confidently, maintaining the image of devoted parents doing everything possible to protect their daughter. Their composure seemed almost rehearsed. What surprised me most was the judge. He wasn't focused on emotional speeches or dramatic accusations. Instead, he quietly asked precise questions about dates. When had Grandma changed her will? When did my parents first seek counseling for me? When were concerns about my mental health first documented? Each answer was carefully written into his notes. His attention kept returning to the same period of time, the weeks immediately after Grandma May's will was revealed. As the questioning continued, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The judge wasn't simply listening to what everyone was saying. He seemed to be measuring when each part of the story had begun. The judge wasn't simply listening to what everyone was saying. He seemed to be measuring when each part of the story had begun. The questioning resumed, and for the first time since the hearing started, I noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice or made shocking accusations. Instead, the judge calmly guided the testimony with one careful question after another, allowing the smallest details to speak for themselves. He asked my father about the day he first became concerned for my mental health. Kurt answered immediately, recalling my expressions, the clothes I had been wearing, and even the exact words I supposedly said. My mother was equally certain when describing moments she believed showed I was emotionally unstable. Together they painted vivid pictures of ordinary days, remembering tiny details with remarkable confidence. Then the judge shifted the subject. When did you first learn the contents of May Rowan's will? Kurt hesitated. He glanced briefly toward his attorney before giving an approximate answer. The judge asked another question. Did you discuss the inheritance with anyone that week? This time, Lena responded, but her answer didn't match her husband's timeline. She corrected herself halfway through, then admitted she couldn't remember the exact sequence of events. It was the first crack I had seen. They claimed to remember conversations from months earlier almost word for word. Yet suddenly the days surrounding Grandma's estate had become strangely unclear. My attorney rose and called Grandma May's longtime attorney to the witness stand. The elderly lawyer spoke without emotion or exaggeration. He explained that May had updated her estate plans carefully over several years and had always been clear about one priority. He wanted my future protected. He never accused my parents of wrongdoing. Instead, he explained that Grandma worried financial expectations could place unnecessary pressure on a young beneficiary. For that reason, she had included safeguards designed to ensure I would receive my inheritance only under the conditions she believed were best for me. Next came Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, the neighbor who had lived beside Grandma for nearly 20 years. She smiled gently at me before answering the questions. Mrs. Briggs described Grandma as practical, thoughtful, and fiercely protective. She recalled quiet conversations over tea where May often said she hoped Bria would always have the freedom to choose her own future without feeling controlled by anyone. Again, there were no accusations, only memories. Yet those memories carried weight because they came from someone with nothing to gain. As the testimony continued, I noticed my parents exchanging uneasy glances. Their confident expressions began slipping whenever Grandma's intentions were discussed. Their attorney objected several times, trying to limit the testimony, but the judge allowed each witness to finish. For the first time that day, the courtroom wasn't focused on whether I was unstable. People were beginning to wonder why Grandma had gone to such careful lengths to protect me in the first place. My parents still sat tall, convinced they could explain everything away. But the certainty they had walked into court with no longer looked quite as convincing. My parents still sat tall, convinced they could explain everything away. But the certainty they had walked into court with no longer looked quite as convincing. The judge leaned back in his chair and quietly reviewed the notes he had taken throughout the hearing. Instead of calling the next witness, he requested the complete estate file, including every amendment to Grandma May's will, the trust documents, and all records connected to the administration of her estate. The courtroom fell silent as folders were carried to the bench. For several minutes he said nothing. He examined signatures, compared dates, and turned pages with deliberate care. There was no sign of impatience or emotion on his face. It became clear that he wasn't interested in deciding the case based on sympathy. He wanted facts that could not be argued away. My parents' attorney finally stood and reminded the court that the purpose of the hearing was my mental competency, not the administration of Grandma's estate. He suggested the documents had little relevance to whether I was capable of managing an inheritance. The judge looked up calmly. "They may have more relevance than you think," he replied before returning to the paperwork. A ripple of quiet whispers spread through the gallery. He continued tracing the sequence of events. Grandma passed away. Her will was presented. My parents learned I was the sole beneficiary. Only afterward did records begin showing counseling appointments, written concerns about my emotional condition, and conversations questioning my ability to handle money responsibly. The order of those events seemed to matter far more to him than the emotional testimony he had heard earlier. He requested additional correspondence from the estate attorney and reviewed forms submitted shortly after the will had been read. Some documents contained dates that matched perfectly. Others raised new questions. Every page seemed to pull his attention back to the same narrow window of time. Again, my parents' attorney tried to redirect the hearing. He returned to selected journal entries, describing my grief as evidence of instability. He argued that my emotional state should remain the court's primary concern. The judge listened politely but did not change course. Instead, he asked when my parents first contacted legal counsel about seeking authority over my inheritance. He wanted exact dates, not estimates. He asked who recommended the evaluations they had requested and why those steps were taken only after the estate had been settled. The questions became increasingly specific. For the first time since entering that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to believe was possible. Hope. Not because anyone had declared me innocent. Not because the case was over. But because someone was finally looking beyond carefully rehearsed stories. The judge wasn't judging my tears or the private words I'd written while mourning Grandma. He was examining actions, decisions, and timing. As I watched him organize the documents into neat stacks, I realized he wasn't searching for the loudest voice in the room. He was searching for the truth hidden between the dates. As I watched him organize the documents into neat stacks, I realized he wasn't searching for the loudest voice in the room. He was searching for the truth hidden between the dates. The judge placed one folder beside another and compared several records before asking the clerk to retrieve additional filings from the probate court. A few minutes later, new documents were handed to him. He studied them carefully, then looked toward my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Knox," he said evenly, "I have a few questions regarding these earlier requests." My father's confident posture stiffened. The judge held up a document showing that, only days after Grandma May's will had been read, my parents had applied for access to part of the estate. They had asked for permission to manage funds they claimed would be used for my benefit before I reached adulthood. Their request had been denied. The trust was written specifically to prevent anyone else from controlling the money unless strict legal conditions were met. The judge turned another page. Only weeks after that denial, my parents had begun gathering records about my emotional health. School notes appeared. Counseling appointments were scheduled. Statements questioning my judgment suddenly became frequent. Soon afterward, they filed the petition asking the court to declare me legally incompetent. The sequence spoke louder than any witness had. My attorney quietly walked to the podium and displayed the timeline for the court. Every major step taken by my parents followed the same pattern. First came the unsuccessful attempt to reach the inheritance. Then came the campaign portraying me as incapable of managing my own affairs. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. My father insisted the timing was nothing more than coincidence. My mother claimed their concern had existed long before Grandma passed away. But when asked why there were no earlier medical reports, school complaints, or legal records supporting those concerns, neither of them gave a clear answer. Their explanations became increasingly inconsistent. One answer contradicted another. Dates shifted. Conversations they had previously described with certainty suddenly became uncertain. The more they tried to explain, the more difficult it became to reconcile their testimony with the paperwork sitting on the judge's desk. Even their attorney seemed unsettled. He paused more often before speaking and spent less time emphasizing my journal. Instead, he attempted to explain procedural decisions and administrative misunderstandings. It was obvious he recognized the focus of the hearing had changed. This was no longer simply about whether I struggled with grief. It was becoming a question of motive. Several people in the gallery exchanged quiet glances as they followed the timeline displayed before them. The picture forming from the documents looked very different from the compassionate story my parents had presented at the beginning of the hearing. For months they had insisted every decision was made to protect me. Now the evidence suggested something else entirely. Their concern had appeared only after they discovered they could not reach the inheritance Grandma May had worked so carefully to place beyond their control, and the courtroom could no longer ignore what that timing might truly mean. Their concern had appeared only after they discovered they could not reach the inheritance Grandma May had worked so carefully to place beyond their control, and the courtroom could no longer ignore what that timing might truly mean. No one spoke for several seconds. The judge closed the file in front of him, folded his hands and looked directly at my parents. His expression hadn't changed throughout the hearing. He wasn't angry or dramatic. If anything, he seemed calmer than before. "I have one final question," he said. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. He referred to a specific clause in Grandma May's will, one that explained why the inheritance had been placed in a protected trust until I reached adulthood. Then he asked a simple question. "When did May Rowan tell you she intended to include this provision, and what reason did she give?" My father answered first. He confidently claimed Grandma had discussed the clause with both of them months before her death and said it was merely a routine legal precaution that carried no special meaning. Before he had even finished, my mother nodded and began speaking. She insisted the conversation happened only a few days before Grandma passed away and claimed May had added the provision because she feared I would make irresponsible financial decisions. The courtroom became perfectly still. The two stories could not both be true. Neither parent seemed to realize they had contradicted each other until the silence stretched across the room. The judge reached for another folder. Without raising his voice, he removed the original signed will along with handwritten notes prepared during meetings between Grandma May and her estate attorney. He carefully placed the documents where everyone could see them. "The court has reviewed the original records," he said. He pointed to the clause in question. The attorney's notes showed that Grandma had decided to create the trust more than a year before her death. The reason was written in clear language. She wanted to ensure Bria would receive her inheritance free from outside financial pressure and protected from anyone attempting to influence decisions before adulthood. There was no mention of mental illness. No concern about my judgment. No suggestion that she doubted my ability to manage my future. The explanation my parents had confidently offered simply did not exist. My attorney didn't need to argue. The documents spoke for themselves. The judge quietly summarized the timeline once more. The trust had been created long before Grandma became seriously ill. My parents had tried to access it after her death. When that failed, they began portraying me as incapable of handling the inheritance. A murmur spread through the courtroom. People who had entered believing I was an unstable teenager were now looking at me with entirely different expressions. The sympathy that had belonged to my parents slowly shifted across the room. For the first time since the hearing began, I no longer felt like the person on trial. The truth had turned the courtroom around, and everyone could finally see that the real target of this carefully planned scheme had never been Grandma's money alone. It had been me. It had been me. The courtroom remained silent as the judge reviewed the final documents before him. My parents no longer looked confident. The calm expressions they had worn throughout the hearing had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty as they realized the carefully constructed story they had relied upon was falling apart piece by piece. My attorney requested permission to submit the complete version of my journal into evidence. The judge agreed. For the first time, the missing pages were read aloud instead of isolated sentences chosen to frighten the court. The entries that had been hidden revealed a very different picture. After writing about heartbreak and loneliness, I had also written about wanting to graduate, honoring Grandma May's memory, volunteering at the local library, and believing that healing would eventually come. The words reflected a grieving teenager searching for hope, not someone detached from reality. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The judge noted that presenting only selected passages had created a false impression of my mental state. He observed that private writings meant to process grief had been stripped of their context and used to support conclusions the complete journal simply did not justify. Next came the financial records. The probate filings denied requests for access to the estate, and the timeline surrounding the competency petition fit together with remarkable consistency. Each document reinforced what the earlier testimony had already suggested. Concern about my well-being had appeared only after my parents failed to gain control of the inheritance. The judge slowly looked toward Kurt and Lena. He spoke firmly without anger, but every word carried weight. He explained that grief is not evidence of incompetence. A young person mourning the loss of a beloved grandparent should be met with compassion, not suspicion. He further stated that transforming private reflections into legal weapons represented a serious misuse of deeply personal material. The court could not accept a competency petition built upon incomplete evidence and unsupported assumptions. Then came the decision. The petition seeking to declare me mentally incompetent was denied in its entirety. For a moment I couldn't move. I had imagined this day so many times, expecting relief or celebration if the truth finally came out. Instead, everything I had held inside for months suddenly became too heavy to carry. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I wasn't crying because of the inheritance. I wasn't thinking about bank accounts, legal documents, or the case that had consumed my life. I cried because someone had finally listened. Someone with no reason to take my side had looked beyond appearances, questioned the contradictions, and believed the evidence instead of the performance. As I wiped my face, I thought about Grandma May and the journal she had given me. She had once told me that honest words mattered even when no one else understood them. At last, those words had been heard. For the first time since losing her, I felt something I thought had disappeared forever. I felt seen. I felt seen. That feeling stayed with me long after the courtroom emptied. In the weeks that followed, life didn't return to normal overnight. But for the first time since Grandma May passed away, I could imagine a future that wasn't controlled by fear. The legal paperwork was completed exactly as she had intended. My inheritance remained safely protected in the trust until I reached adulthood, beyond anyone's personal influence. Knowing her wishes had been honored brought me a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever replace. The consequences for my parents arrived quietly. Relatives who had once accepted their version of events began distancing themselves after learning what had happened in court. Neighbors who had believed I was unstable realized they had been misled. Teachers who had looked at me with concern now greeted me with kindness instead of pity. My parents hadn't lost because of a dramatic confrontation. They lost because the truth had finally reached the people who mattered. As for me, I chose not to spend my energy chasing revenge. Grandma had always encouraged me to look ahead instead of remaining trapped by pain. I focused on graduating from high school and applying to colleges. Writing, the habit she had lovingly given me years before, became something I embraced rather than feared. Every page reminded me that honest emotions never needed to be hidden, no matter how someone else tried to misuse them. When I finally gained access to part of the inheritance, I used it carefully. A portion went toward my education just as Grandma had hoped. Another part helped me create a small scholarship in her memory for students who had overcome difficult circumstances. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was my way of extending the kindness she had shown me throughout my life. The old leather journal still sits on my bookshelf today. For a long time I couldn't bear to open it because it reminded me of everything my parents had done. Now I see it differently. It isn't evidence of illness. It isn't a collection of painful memories. It's proof that I survived a chapter of my life that was meant to silence me. Sometimes people believe justice belongs to the loudest voice, the strongest accusation, or the most convincing performance. My story taught me something very different. Real justice often begins with one person who is willing to ask the right question and patiently follow the answer wherever it leads. On the anniversary of Grandma May's birthday, I visited her grave carrying fresh white lilies and the journal she had given me. I placed my hand against the cool stone and smiled through quiet tears. "Thank you," I whispered. "You protected me even after you were gone." The wind stirred gently through the trees, and for the first time in a very long while, I walked away feeling that I wasn't leaving her behind. I was carrying her love with me into the life she had always believed I deserved. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.